They skipped my name like I was invisible, and the finance volunteer, pearls tight at her throat, pen hovering with a practiced smirk, let a younger man cut ahead while a guard pried open my bag, the corridor bright as a stage, lemon-polished wood gleaming, wet coats steaming under fluorescent hum, choir voices warming like distant thunder. I stood there with my clear envelope, numbered receipt flashing, the maestro's letterhead pressed flat, feeling the cool varnish bite my palms as her eyes slid over me with that easy cruelty reserved for people who are expected to swallow it, a quiet widow's man in a pressed jacket, while she clicked her tongue about proper records and waved me to the side as if my place were a shadow. But I didn't raise my voice. I centered the paper, marked the time, caught two steady witnesses in the corner of my eye, and when she said it didn't exist, I breathed once, lifted the page, and promised myself that before this hymn finishes, we will follow the ink to where the truth cannot be ignored. One request before the next scene: subscribe, comment where you're watching, and share this story. Light spreads when we pass it on. They skipped my name like it wasn't there, and the hand that should have welcomed me found my fingers only to cool them and let go. October air followed me in from the steps, carrying the faint damp of fallen leaves. Inside, the church smelled of lemon polish and old paper, candle wax cooling on brass plates, a trace of coffee drifting from the fellowship room. I stood with my clear envelope tucked under my arm, the slick edge sticking to my sleeve, the receipt's numbered corner visible like a small white tooth. The choir warmed up across the hall, voices humming scales that climbed and fell, while I waited in a line that kept moving around me as if I were a column best walked past. The volunteer at the finance table glanced at my envelope and looked away, her eyes sliding to the next form, the next pen, the next friendly laugh. A ledger lay open in front of her, narrow-ruled, green lines pale as winter grass. She let the tip of her pen hover over a name that was not mine. My chest tightened, not from surprise, just from the familiar weight that grief wears into a man when he stands alone in a room where couples and families make an easy kind of weather. I pressed my palm to the envelope's face, feeling the raised stamp from the letter beneath, the maestro's words folded inside, the kind of note I keep with the others, the handwriting of people who once took time to say what mattered. The light over the table buzzed, a thin electric insect trapped in glass. I watched a young man slide his form forward. He had arrived after me. He left with a pat on the shoulder, and his laughter caught on the edge of the hymn the altos were practicing. My turn came and went the way a train passes a dark platform at night. Wind, noise, nothing else. The security guard stepped toward me with a neutral expression and asked to see inside my bag. His gloved hands were gentle but unnecessary, the vinyl squeak of the zipper louder than it needed to be. He found nothing but a pencil case, a paperback with a cracked spine, and the cloth pouch where I keep small anchors, paper clips, a spare pair of reading glasses, the stub of a blue highlighter.
I breathed in through the nose and out through the mouth, the way my wife used to tell me when the world pushed in too close. The choir's tenors held a note that felt like the inside of a held breath. I set the envelope on the table, square to the edge, and beneath the overhead hum I could hear the shush of papers sliding in drawers, the muted clatter of a stapler, the scrape of a chair leg. The volunteer's eyes returned to me without warmth. The corner of her mouth softened into something that wasn't quite a smile. Behind her, the small office door stood barely ajar, a dim slice of hallway visible through the gap. I lifted the receipt from the envelope and laid it next to the ledger, the number at the top clear and whole. The paper was smooth and a little stiff, the ink just glossy enough to catch the light. I placed the letter beside it, the maestro's letterhead simple and clean, a treble clef embossed in gray. The hum of conversation at my back dipped for a moment, a change in pressure more than sound. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a pair of parishioners pause, 2 coats still damp from the drizzle. My name was not on the volunteer's lips. My name was a card slipped under a door no one opened. The line bent again. Another person arrived, was noticed, was shuffled forward. I was asked to wait to the side, where the hymnals leaned in an uneven stack, and a scuffed wooden chair pinched my coat sleeve when I sat. The wall behind me held a bulletin with announcements and small strips of paper pinned under thumbtacks. Buried among youth group notices and casserole sign-ups was a narrow sheet labeled Financial Policy Summary, its corners curled from dry air. It listed modest clauses in a font chosen by someone who prefers quiet over flourish. I read the lines once, twice, and found what I needed to remember. Disputes shall be reviewed with documentation present. Entries and exits shall be matched and initialed. My fingers loosened around the envelope. The security guard returned my bag with a nod I had to tilt my head to catch. He moved on, the squeak of his shoes marking time between my heartbeat and the soprano's higher notes. I thought of the box of letters in my closet, the smell of cedar from the little blocks I keep there to keep moths away, how paper, given time and patience, becomes a second kind of skin. I took out a folded page from my pocket notebook and wrote the time from the wall clock, the position of my receipt on the table, the names I could see on laminated tags, the sequence of who was served when. Not anger, a ledger of moments. I felt my granddaughter before I saw her. Ava has a way of leaning into a room as if it's a question she's already half answered. She slipped beside me for a heartbeat between warm-up and her own rehearsal, eyes quick, braid damp at the end, the powdery smell of pencil shavings clinging to her sweater from school. She studied the receipt and the letter the way children study trick pictures hunting for mistakes. Her phone rested in her palm like a mirror turned dark. The maestro's warming chords rolled through the hallway, vibrating the wood under our feet. I touched her shoulder, and she understood the ask I didn't voice. She lifted the phone and took a quiet record of what lay on the table. The number, the date, the letterhead, the ledger's empty space where a line with my name should have been. Then the children's director called from the doorway with a hand motion, and she was gone down the hall in 3 light steps.
I rose with the choir's swell and rolled the stiffness from one shoulder. The volunteer kept her eyes on the ledger. She gathered papers and slipped into the small office beyond the ajar door. The click of her shoes on tile sounded like punctuation at the end of a sentence not yet written. My envelope caught a draft and slid a finger's width. I steadied it. 2 members of the congregation, faces I knew but could not name, stood near enough to be counted as witnessing without being asked. The rain outside had thinned to a mist. The window above the bulletin winked with tiny dots that rejoined and separated again, an alphabet of water. I thought about my wife's list-making, how she would number each item even when there were only 2, because order teaches patience. 12 lines, I told myself. 12 entries, a month accounted for in ordinary ink. I took my pencil and drew 3 columns on my notebook page, small and neat. Date, entry, exit. The graphite left a soft sheen where it pressed hard, a darker ridge when I slowed. I copied the receipt number. I wrote the amount. I left space for the rest. The organist tested a lower register, the heavy wood hum filling the corridor like the inside of a drum. The volunteer returned with a gray-labeled binder balanced against her hip and said something to the attendant in a voice too low for the room. The attendant looked at me and looked away,
then reached for a box of forms. The binder disappeared into the office again. The security guard posted himself near the end of the desk, posture politely neutral, eyes elsewhere and not elsewhere. A man in a wool coat laughed behind me, the sound bright and brief, and then he quieted when he noticed my envelope on the table like a place card set without a name. I asked for the supervisor with a raised finger and a breath I could feel all the way down. The attendant nodded, a mechanical assent, and pressed the bell that rings in the side office, a bell that lacks romance but carries authority, a short, flat ding that clung to the air after it stopped. I kept my feet planted and my shoulders open, palms resting on the table's edge to feel the tack of varnish and the grain beneath, thinking only of steps as small as a bead on a string. Receipt visible, letter present, policy posted, supervisor called. The choir's warm-up shifted to a hymn I know by heart. The alto line traced a path I have followed for years, a line that always resolves if you do not rush it. 2 pews over, a mother stamped a wet umbrella dry and smoothed her child's collar. The smell of damp wool climbed the air for a moment and vanished. I saw the maestro pass the hall's far end, eyes on the set list clipped to his folder. He recognized the letterhead at my elbow with a slight incline of his chin, a recognition as small as a key turning in a pocket. The door to the inner office opened, and the supervisor stepped into the corridor carrying the gray binder with both hands, his thumb tucked under the rings as if the pages might slip free. He had a pen clipped to his collar, and the kind of tired patience people learn from too many evenings of small fires. He scanned the table, the envelope, the letter, my hands. The binder's plastic edge caught the light. The choir's last note drained away and left the corridor hollow and waiting. The binder hit the counter with a flat, heavy sound.
The sound flattened the air, and for a second I felt the wood under my palms vibrate through the varnish. The supervisor set the gray binder square to the table's edge and nodded once to the attendant, once to the security guard, once to me. He didn't smile and he didn't frown. He adjusted his pen at the collar as if symmetry might keep the evening from tilting. The hall smelled of wet coats and lemon oil, a mix that always reminds me of school cafeterias after a storm. Somewhere behind us, a chair skidded and bumped, and the choir shifted from warm-ups to the first verse of a hymn that knows how to climb a staircase and come down without missing a step. I gave him the envelope, the overall weight of it familiar in my hand, the slick drag of the plastic catching at my fingerprints. He slid out the receipt and the letter with his wrist straight, as if the angle mattered. He scanned the receipt's number, touched the top corner with one fingertip, then placed it on the binder's cover and set the letter beside it. The embossed treble clef raised a pale curve against the light. He was careful in the way of someone who has spent years with paper, the small economy of motion that comes from not wanting to redo what should be done right the first time. The volunteer hovered at his shoulder, a circle of keys peeking from her sweater pocket. Her perfume drifted up and vanished before it settled into a name. She made a note on a sticky strip with a square-tipped pen, blocked letters that could be read from a distance and meant to be. My name did not show on the ledger between her hands, not yet, not at that angle, not at the speed the room was moving. Behind me, someone coughed into a sleeve and apologized to no one. On the far end of the table, the attendant restacked forms with the edge of his palm, lining corners like dominoes that refused to fall. I asked for the list of entries and exits for the month, the 12 lines that should match the receipt I had carried here like a small light. The supervisor opened the binder. The plastic rings clicked as they parted, dry and precise like a zipper with an opinion. He flipped a tab, another. The paper whisper was louder than the choir for half a breath.
The hymn came back in through the doorway, the alto line threading a steady rope through the corridor. I saw his eyes move left to right, the way a man reads a page he thinks he knows. The security guard shifted his stance 2 degrees toward us, not intruding, just registering. He was close enough for me to see the webbing of his belt and the polish on the snap of his glove. He glanced at the envelope, at my hands, at the binder, learning the shapes in case he needed to remember them later. The volunteer stepped a half-pace closer, her keys ringing once against her thigh. She said she needed to finish one thing before we took up the line, and even as she spoke, 2 more people were guided past me, their forms clipped, their questions answered with a speed I had already learned not to expect. I felt the old tug in my chest, a soft alarm that doesn't blare, just holds and holds. I put the tips of my fingers on the table again and looked down at the wood grain until I could feel the grain's pattern anchor me. Each curve of the grain was a slow river. My life used to say this exact movement was my tell, the way I waited for the world to show its next step before I took one of my own. I breathed through my nose and found the lemon oil again, the brightness of it hiding under the wool and wet and coffee.
Ava slipped back to my side between songs like a small note returning to a melody. She had a cup of water with a lid and pressed it into my hand as if she were returning a borrowed coin. Her hair had loosened at the nape with the heat from the rehearsal room. A smear of pencil gray was on the side of her finger. The director called, she lifted a finger to say, 1 minute, and we made that small, private pact with our eyes. She checked the wall clock and whispered the time in the way of someone who knows different clocks disagree. Then she paused, glanced at the binder, at the receipt, and the phone in her hand woke to a dim light, as if it knew it was expected. The supervisor adjusted the binder's tab to the month. The sheet he stopped on had columns that wore their rules like old shoes, dates down the left, descriptions in a narrow band, amounts on the right balanced like questions waiting for answers. He rubbed the top of the page the way paper people do to flatten a dog ear that wants to rise. The choir swelled and then thinned. A single soprano note broke loose and hung like a glass ornament until it rejoined the rest. The volunteer put the sticky note down by the edge of the binder and leaned her hip into the table. She asked softly if we could take this into the small office. The supervisor did not move, only flicked a look at the security guard and then back down. 2 parishioners I know by face and handshake stood near the hymnals as if they were deciding whether to sit or stand. One nodded at me, the other studied the bulletin board, his gaze catching on the sheet labeled Financial Policy Summary, its corner curled and casting a small crescent shadow. The printed line that had stayed with me earlier sat there as plain as an arrow in daylight. Disputes shall be reviewed with documentation present. Entries and exits shall be matched and initialed. I repeated it in my head the way I repeat a phone number from the radio when I need to write it down later. The volunteer returned to the office door, spoke to someone I couldn't see, then reappeared with another thin folder whose tab had yellowed along one edge. She handed it to the attendant. The attendant handed it to the supervisor. The supervisor didn't take it. He kept his place in the binder with the edge of his hand and lifted only his eyes to the folder like someone acknowledging a package left at their feet. The choir shifted to a new piece, and the maestro's steps traced the hallway again, his folder held against his chest with that same protective angle I had seen in his letter. My bag rested at my shoes, the zipper closed where the guard had left it. I could picture, without looking, the contents: the pencil case with the stump of a blue highlighter, the paperback folded open at a paragraph where a man decides to wait 1 more minute, the cloth pouch with a spool of thread and a needle I never remember adding. Waiting makes a catalog out of small things, the way a stapler clicks and leaves a paper smelling of warm metal, the way varnish under a fingernail feels like a rougher wood, the way a child's sneaker taps twice when she is ready to go back to her song. Ava's sneaker tapped, then stilled. She touched the corner of the receipt again, carefully, and looked at me with that narrow crease between her eyebrows that she inherited from her mother. It is the crease that asks, "If you are all right?" without making you answer. I told her I was fine by moving my shoulders so the seams sat where they belong. She watched the supervisor turn the page and lifted her phone the smallest amount, the lens no higher than the plane of his sleeve.
The supervisor's face did not change, and it changed. He found the month's summary. I saw it in the way his eyes landed and held, then darted to the top margin where someone had scribbled a note about deposits awaiting verification. He put his finger on the line dividing 1 week from the next, followed it down as if it were a seam on a shirt he was tailoring. He stopped where the week should have matched the date on my receipt. His mouth made a shape I had seen before in other rooms, at other counters, on other evenings. It is a shape that does not name itself, because naming is what comes after. The volunteer reached around him and placed the thin folder on the binder's open page, not covering, only proposing. The attendant slid a box of paper clips closer, as if organization were a kind of apology. A couple in heavy coats asked if this would take long and were waved kindly toward the other end of the table. The guard's radio crackled a wordless confirmation and then went quiet. The bulletin board's curled corner lifted and fell again. I wrote another small line on my notebook page, time from the wall clock, position of the binder, who stood where, who said what, in what order. It wasn't proof yet. It was the map proof needs to find its way. I let the cool of the water lid press against my lower lip without drinking. My heartbeat faded from my ears just enough for me to hear the scratch of the supervisor's pen as he wrote a question mark next to a date in the margin, then drew a tiny box around it, a box too small to hold anyone's name. Ava murmured that she needed to go back before the children's call. I squeezed her hand once, the way we do when we say, "Stay brave." She squeezed back twice, the way she says, "I am here." She slipped away, and her perfume, something clean and faint as a new eraser, was replaced by the sharper smell of a photocopier starting in the office behind the door. Light flickered against the frosted glass pane and went still again. The supervisor closed his hand over the receipt gently, not taking it, just weighing the corner with his fingertips. He looked up at me for the first time, as if he were measuring my height against the doorway. He glanced at the bulletin board. He glanced at the two parishioners by the hymnals. He tapped the binder's page twice with the side of his pen, a sound like someone rapping a knuckle against a small drum. He asked me to step to the side table for a clearer surface, and as we moved, the binder's rings caught and clicked. The volunteer gathered the ledger. The attendant wiped the table with a folded paper towel, leaving a damp crescent that cooled the back of my hand when I reached to steady the binder again. The choir stopped and breathed in together for the next piece. The intake of air ran down the corridor like a low tide. I centered the receipt, squared the letter, and waited for his fingertip to land where it meant to land. The line where my number should have lived was clean as winter. Clean as winter meant blank, and blank meant I was still standing outside the door of a house that should have been mine to enter. The supervisor's finger hovered over the space as if body heat could coax ink to appear. He didn't look at me. He looked at the margin for a note that might rescue the empty line from saying nothing. The binder's plastic sleeve crinkled when his wrist pressed too hard. Behind us, a tenor reset his pitch with a soft cough, and the piano gave 3 patient notes like a teacher counting off. I kept the receipt centered to keep myself centered. The number at the top stayed honest under the fluorescence, unbothered by the way the ledger regarded it like a stranger at the door. The attendant shuffled forms to my left, quick and neat, the clap of each stack like polite applause for a performance I wasn't giving.
The volunteer moved one step closer and then another, her keys tapping her thigh in a rhythm that said hurry without saying it. The security guard's radio hissed and settled back into a small square of static. I didn't raise my voice because raising it would have been stepping out of myself. I asked, evenly, to match entries and exits for the month, to lay the receipt beside what the binder claimed. The supervisor adjusted his pen against his collar and let the binder breathe. He turned a page. He turned it back. The empty space stayed a winter field. I heard the children's choir down the hall switch to a melody where the last word hangs just longer than you expect, a lesson in not rushing an ending. Ava's sneakers whispered across the tile before I saw her. She came in with a thin sheet of paper rolled in her hand and a flush at the apple of her cheeks from singing. There was a smudge of graphite near the heel of her palm, a badge of taking notes seriously. She stood by my elbow and read the table without touching it, the way she stands by the stove and reads the temperature of a skillet by the way oil moves. I felt the warmth of her arm without leaning. She didn't speak. She aligned her breath with mine, a small mirror that steadied the shape of the minutes. The volunteer suggested, again, that we take this inside the office. The word inside did more work than it needed to. Inside meant behind the frosted glass, away from the bulletin board with the policy summary that had already told the truth in plain type. I asked that we remain here, by the posted policy and the people who had become witnesses by the artless act of standing still. The security guard's chin dipped half an inch, which is how agreement looks when a uniform has to stay neutral. I placed my notebook on the cleared corner of the table and drew 3 lines with my pencil, the point leaving a silver-gray ridge that caught when I tilted the page. Date, entry, exit. The lead bruised the paper in a way I have always liked, a way that proves something happened even if someone tries to erase it. I wrote the receipt number again and the amount and left room for signatures. My wife used to trace her finger down a column and hum when she found a misaligned figure. The hum lives somewhere in my chest, and when I am calm, I hear it. The supervisor tugged a thin folder from under the binder and flipped to the back where addenda go when people hope not to need them. He found a slip that looked like a placeholder and turned it sideways to make it make sense. The volunteer set a sticky note by his hand with my name spelled correctly in thick square letters. The attendant brought a small tray with paper clips and a retractable stamp, the kind that leaves a date tiredly precise on anything that passes under it. A couple in scarves asked about pledge envelopes and were kindly directed to the far end, the smell of their wet wool trailing a dark, clean line through the lemon and coffee.
2 parishioners stayed where they had been, near the hymnals, possibly to watch, possibly because standing still felt right. One of them adjusted his glasses in that absent way that people adjust distance when they are deciding what they saw. I noted the time on the wall clock and the way the second hand ticked past a burn mark in the varnish that looked like a crescent moon. I counted to 5 and counted back, and in that small piece of breath I let myself think of the cedar scent of the letterbox at home, how paper keeps faith if you keep it dry and out of the sun. The supervisor's thumbnail tracked across the ledger again, found the week I had found, followed the seam to the date. He marked the margin with a question mark, faint enough to pass for dust. The volunteer's mouth pressed flat. She asked for the receipt back for a moment to photocopy, and I kept my hand on the corner until the request came as a sentence that included return. Words matter when minutes are thin. She took it, disappeared into the office, and I could hear the copier warm like a small oven, the smell of hot toner threading the air, a faint sweetness with a chemical edge. Ava leaned closer, her shoulder a small anchor at my side, and read the policy summary on the bulletin board. She didn't read it out loud. She read it the way a student reads rules before a lab experiment. She counted the clauses with her fingers, tapping her thumb for each one like she was learning a rhythm. The line about disputes being reviewed with documentation present was the one she tapped twice. I nodded once. She looked at the parishioners near the hymnals and then at me. "Witnesses," her eyes said, and then her eyes went back to the binder. The volunteer returned with the photocopy, edges still warm, and placed it on the table as if weight added truth. The supervisor set the copy beside the original without shifting the angle. I aligned my notebook's columns to the edge of the copy and wrote again, the number, the date, the amount. The pencil left a whisper each time it lifted, a sound that felt like sand being brushed off a stone. I asked again evenly for the list of entries and exits for the month to be placed alongside, as the policy required, so that initialing could be more than a habit. The supervisor didn't argue. He closed the binder 2/3 of the way, then opened it to the month again, slower this time, as if speed had been the problem. The children's choir down the hall broke into a melody about patience that would have made my wife laugh for its timing. The security guard glanced at the bulletin board as if memorizing the policy might be part of his shift after tonight. The attendant fetched a clean blotter and placed it under the binder like a mat for a photograph that deserves respect. The emptiness of that line was not the only thing in the ledger. The page held other names, entries that looked like steps across a field. I was not erasing them by asking for my piece to be placed where it belonged. I reminded myself of that because a room like this teaches you to apologize for asking paper to tell the truth. I straightened the letter from the maestro so that the embossed clef sat upright, a quiet road sign pointing toward the music that had brought me here in the first place. I let the choir's chord settle in my ribs and do its slow work.
Ava shifted her weight, the rubber of her sneaker sole making a tiny kiss against the tile. She leaned toward my notebook, and I slid it an inch so she could see the columns. She traced one line down with her finger without touching, a child's way of proofing a parent's handwriting. The volunteer's keys tapped her thigh once, then went still. The supervisor pressed the corner of the binder with the heel of his hand to flatten a curl. He lifted his pen as if to write, and then set it down again without marking anything, as if ink were heavier than it used to be. I asked for the policy to be read, here at the table, not in an office, not later, not after the choir had finished and people had gone home and memory had turned soft around the edges. The posted summary was not a suggestion, it was a promise, printed in mild font on curled paper. The supervisor turned toward the bulletin board, and I saw something shift in his posture. Not a conversion, not yet, just the acceptance that words hung for all to see had to be said out loud to do their work. His hand hovered near the push pins. The volunteer glanced at the security guard. The security guard didn't change expression, which read like permission. The attendant slid the retractable stamp back toward himself and squared the tray of paper clips again. A small hush settled at the end of the corridor as if the room agreed that breath was what came next. The piano caught a fragment of the choir's next piece and let it go. I thought of my wife again, not as a lament, but as a measure. She would have told me to keep the map visible and walk it with small steps. Map means columns, map means names, map means numbers that agree or don't, and witnesses who can say what they saw. I pressed the receipt's corner to stop a draft from lifting it, felt the tooth of the paper against my fingertip, the tiny shine of the ink where the light ran across it. I lined the maestro's letterhead with the binder's edge until 2 straight lines made one. Ava's hand found my sleeve and rested there, a quick warm weight that asked nothing and offered everything. The 2 parishioners near the hymnal stepped forward half a pace without being called, then stopped, their shoes scuffing once. The volunteer breathed in as if preparing to explain something that no longer wanted explaining. The supervisor reached toward the bulletin board, slid the thumbtack up with his nail, and freed the policy sheet with a soft scrape. I said, "Please read it here," and he pinched the top corners to keep the curl from swallowing the first line, and the room leaned toward the paper, as if sound could be seen before it was heard. He lifted the policy to his mouth and drew breath. If this moment speaks to you, like it, comment your view, and share. Each click invites another witness. He read the policy aloud in a steady voice, each clause shaped by breath and practiced neutrality. The paper trembled a little where his fingers pinched the curling corners, then flattened as he pressed it against the counter and traced the first line with his thumb. Dispute shall be reviewed with documentation present. Entries and exits shall be matched and initialed. The words belonged to the wall a moment ago and now belong to the room. The volunteer stood very still, keys no longer tapping her thigh. The attendant's posture softened the way a tight knot begins to give. The security guard shifted his weight and let his attention widen, as if hearing the policy freed him to see the hallway as a place for order rather than interruption.
He set the policy sheet beside the binder and receipt, then asked for a clean surface. The attendant wiped again, leaving a darker circle that cooled quickly. I placed my notebook on the dry side and squared the corners with the edge. The plan I had carried in pieces became steps on the table. Read the rule, lay out the documents, build the simple grid that any honest eye could follow. The choir in the rehearsal room took a breath together and began a new hymn that rose like stairs and landed softly each time. I let that rhythm guide my hands. The supervisor opened the binder to the month and adjusted the blotter beneath. He pulled a stack of small deposit slips from the thin folder and fanned them with a quick motion, the paper whispering like cards learned by touch. He placed the slips in one column, the ledger in the center, the receipt and the photocopy in a clean stack to the left, and the policy on the right where the witnesses could read over his shoulder if they chose. He touched the dated stamp on the tray without using it, as if reminding himself that the evening would end with ink that recorded what we did. Ava slid to my side again, the warmth of her shoulder a deliberate anchor. She checked the wall clock, then tapped the first column of my notebook with 2 fingers. I wrote the date, the receipt number, the amount, and left space for an initial. Her phone remained face down on the counter, the camera asleep, the black glass reflecting the overhead light in a soft square. She breathed a little faster than the room, held it, then matched me. We were a small engine idling. 2 parishioners stepped nearer the hymnals, no longer pretending to browse. One rested his palm on the back of a chair and leaned so the policy sheet was within reading distance. The other pushed his glasses up and nodded once when the supervisor paused at the second clause. The volunteer returned to the bulletin board and straightened a crooked announcement with a kind of carefulness that felt like apology made with hands rather than words. The security guard lifted the radio from his belt, spoke into it briefly, then replaced it and made a small note on a pocket card, logging the time of the review. The supervisor began to match what could be matched. He read the ledger line for the first week, found the corresponding deposit slip, and placed them together like 2 halves of a folded letter. His pen made a small tick in the margin, not yet an initial, just a marker. He moved to the second week. The children's choir reached the bridge of their song and widened the sound. The piano's low keys hummed under the thin wall like a slow engine turning a wheel. My hands settled further. The beat in my chest found the measure. The earlier frictions found their closures in quietly human ways. The attendant adjusted the order of waiting so that those who had slipped past me circled back when their tasks could wait. A couple waved and returned to the fellowship room for a coffee. The security guard placed a brief line in his incident log, noting that a bag check had been conducted with no issue. He nodded in my direction, not as permission, but as recognition. The volunteer, who had hovered and hurried, set a small stack of pledge envelopes into a neat box, then took from a drawer a laminated sheet that summarized the policy in even plainer language and laid it by the posted paper so that anyone passing could read it without squinting at fine print.
I copied the first 2 matched items into my notebook grid, my pencil leaving the faint shine of pressure on the paper. I left a space where the line for my date would live. I did not push the pencil there yet. I watched the supervisor's thumb move down the ledger's edge, the nail catching on a page that had been turned more than others. He stopped where he had stopped before. The margin still held the faint question mark. He did not look at me. He looked at the paper as if it could hear an answer. The maestro appeared at the end of the corridor and stood there for a moment, his folder against his chest, his baton cucked into the spine, his breathing even from the walk. He offered a small nod that contained both greeting and patient inquiry. He was not a judge and not a defendant. He was the steward of a room full of voices trying to meet each other on the same note. He stepped closer when the supervisor gestured and took a place where his eyes could see the ledger without crowding. His nearness steadied the table like a third leg under a heavy plank. The volunteer returned from the small office with 2 narrow printouts that looked like acknowledgments from the bank. She placed them to the side with a nervous care that kept them square. The supervisor compared the printed amounts to the ledger headings and let a breath out that wasn't quite a sigh. He ticked the second week's last line with the side of his pen and set his finger at the start of the third. The photocopier in the office whirred once and fell silent. The smell of warm toner faded into the sharper scent of coffee grounds emptied into a trash can. I wrote the names of the 2 parishioners near the hymnals into my notebook under a heading I left blank. I did not know if they would sign, but names have a way of becoming ballast when a wind rises. Ava read over my shoulder and then looked up at the policy again. She pointed her chin toward the clause about review with documentation present and let her mouth shape the first few words without voice, a silent rehearsal that made the policy hers to say if needed. Her insistence on learning has its own gravity. I felt grateful for the way she gathers facts when emotion wants to run. The supervisor paused. He moved the deposit slips aside and pulled the thin folder back into play. He found a small worksheet in a familiar hand, the same square letters the volunteer used on sticky notes, a list of items marked pending verification. The page was dated 2 days earlier and paperclipped to another sheet that announced a deposit run delayed by weather. He placed that sheet above the ledger, not quite touching it, and lined its date with the margin where the question mark lived. He did not speak, but the alignment itself said we were stepping from fog into a path. I drew a small line in my grid that would hold a third column initial when the time came. The choir's song ended, and a short scatter of laughter made its way down the hall before the maestro lifted his head and the room quieted again. He remained by the table. He placed the tip of his finger on the corner of his letter, a gesture so light it barely indented the paper. I felt the ghost of my wife's hum again, that bright thread of approval when a figure starts to reconcile.
The attendant, who had been careful with forms all evening, brought a small stack of blank acknowledgement slips and set them near the stamp, then added a pen with fresh ink. He turned to the volunteer and asked for the internal reference number for the weekly bank deposit. She found it and read it softly, then wrote it on the thin worksheet beside pending verification. The security guard checked his pocket card and added that time as a new line, a quiet ledger of his own. One by one, the small snags of the evening found their places. The couple who had circled back returned and completed their question without taking precedence. The bulletin board's corners were flattened with clear tape cut cleanly. The damp circle on the counter faded to the color of the rest of the varnish. The hum of the fluorescent light steadied as if a ballast had decided to cooperate. In the rehearsal room, the children began a song about building something together with hands and patience. The words drifted through the door in pieces and landed in the corridor as intention more than language. I took the plan I had sketched in my head and made it visible. I slid a clean sheet from my notebook, ruled the same 3 columns with calmer strokes, and wrote a heading that named only what could be seen: date, entry, exit. I placed it beside the ledger and receipt so that the lines, existing and expected, could be seen at once. The supervisor nodded, the kind of nod that acknowledges a tool that does its job. He set his pen at the top of the third week and did not lift it. Ava's hand found my sleeve again and squeezed once, her way of asking if I needed water or a chair or a story to float me through. I shook my head and felt the jacket seam slide back into place. She lifted her phone, not to film, but to take a single still of the layout, the policy and frame with the ledger and the grid, a picture that said only "here is where we are." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and stood straighter, ready in the way that readiness looks when it belongs to someone young and certain. I felt the temperature of the room shift from the restless heat of a crowded corridor to the mild warmth of work done in sequence. No one raised a voice, no one became a hero. The table became a small field where lines met, and where they didn't meet yet, we left space without forcing a conclusion. The plan was not dramatic. It was ordinary and sound. Read the rule, match the lines, initial what agreed, note what required a step. Keep witnesses near enough to see the ink dry. The supervisor adjusted the binder so the spine set comfortably and glanced once more at the question mark in the margin. The maestro stood at ease, a presence that rounded the edge of the moment without dulling it. The volunteer squared the pending worksheet so no corner hid anything. The security guard turned the stamp upside down to check the date and set it upright again. The security guard leaned a knuckle against the counter and rested, his duty satisfied by the transparency of the light. We were not finished. We were pointed. I aligned the receipt with the grid and the ledger and felt the small click inside that comes when a path clears in a thicket. The evening had found its floor again. The hymn in the other room ended with a soft chord that did not ask for applause. I breathed with it, let my shoulders drop their last unnecessary height, and waited for the next right step with a calm that felt earned.
The room settled into a kind of a tension that feels like a held cord. The supervisor kept the binder open to the month, the policy sheet anchored by his palm, the receipt and its copy aligned to the left. He lifted the pen at last and placed the tip on the third week, the date that had lived like a hollow in the ledger. He did not fill it with imagination. He placed the receipt number beside the ledger's gap and allowed the paper to say what it could no longer avoid. The deposit slips that matched the earlier weeks lay like stepping stones behind us. The pending sheet, dated 2 days ago, sat aligned with the margin question mark, as if the paper itself had waited for our eyes to meet it. He began reading the lines aloud in the plain way procedures deserve. Week 1 matched deposits 1 through 4. Week 2 matched 5 through 8. Week 3 held 9 through 11. The amount that would be 12 waited in my receipt, inked in the same hand that signed the earlier entries. He set the receipt on the ledger's line and made a small, careful mark indicating the provisional match pending verification. He asked the volunteer for the internal reference number again and wrote it neatly in the ledger's margin at that line. The ledger, which had treated me as a stranger all evening, made room for my name without flourish. The hall changed in those inches. Not the temperature, not the light, both remained themselves, but the fact that the ledger recognized in public view the truth that had sat on the table all along. The attendant placed the retractable stamp within reach, ink ready. The security guard wrote the time in his pocket log and underlined it once. The two parishioners stepped closer and took positions that made their witnessing active and not accidental. The maestro remained steady, eyes on the page, posture telling the choir across the hall to hold a rest and wait for the downbeat. Then came the part I had prepared for, but not rushed. I slid my clean 3-column sheet fully into view and announced, with the same even tone I had used for the last hour, that I would list in plain handwriting entries 1 through 12 as verified in sequence,
with a space for initials by the supervisor after each match. The supervisor nodded. He initialed 1 through 11, pausing to check the deposit slips before each. At 12, he wrote the internal reference number and the word pending in neat block letters he had probably practiced when he first learned how to keep community books. The volunteer released a breath she had been holding between her teeth and went to the small office to retrieve a second copy of the bank acknowledgement that the earlier sheet had predicted. When she returned, the consequence arrived to meet the formality. The acknowledgement, delayed by weather, had cleared. The deposit patch contained the amount that matched my receipt, stamped with the bank's machine date, 2 days late but intact. She laid the slip next to the ledger. The supervisor compared numbers, amounts, initials, and dates the way a person tests a plank before stepping to the next. He lifted the stamp, centered it over the ledger line, and pressed. The date left its square black footprint. He initialed 12 with the same letters he had used for the others. Silence did not follow. It changed shape. The corridor's noises returned, coat sleeves rubbing, a cough tucked into a rest, the distant squeak of a dolly in the fellowship room, but each sound carried less edge. My name, written at last where it should have been, looked unremarkable and exactly right. The maestro rested a finger on the corner of his letter and at last allowed himself to smile with his eyes, the private kind that says the music can continue now that the measure has been counted correctly.
Consequences for the evening's frictions came next, not as punishment but as results made visible. The supervisor turned the policy sheet so everyone could read and declared in his measured tone that the financial summary would be posted at month's end in plain view and that any disputes would be reviewed at this table with documentation present and witnesses welcome. He added that the volunteer team would receive a short training on intake, sequence, and the necessity of not moving a person backward in a line without cause. The attendant recorded a new step in the routine, stamp an initial at the time of deposit acknowledgement, not later in a quiet office. The security guard wrote that bag checks would be conducted at a separate station with privacy and a record so that dignity would not be collateral to routine. The volunteer faced the table squarely. The keys at her side were still. She said she would correct the bulletin board today by adding the laminated summary in larger type, and that she would flag any pending verification with a visible marker so no one would stand in a hall and try to read in absence. She did not defend the earlier slide in attention. She took responsibility for what could be made better. Her shoulders eased when the supervisor nodded, relief and resolve sharing the same small breath. The parishioner who had first dismissed the donation had stood at the far end of the corridor until the stamp landed, until the ledger bore my name, until the posted policy had been read aloud to the room as if it had been written for tonight. She approached without hurry, eyes traveling over the receipt and the stamped line, and the note that read, "Pending resolved." She stopped short of reaching for my hand and instead placed her palm flat on the counter beside my grid, close enough to feel the table's varnish and the friction of paper. I let the silence do the work that no speech could improve. I did not perform grace. I allowed the room's return to order to be the apology's shape. Ava stood at my shoulder, breath steady, eyes bright with the quiet relief of work completed in sequence. The crease between her brows was gone. She checked my columns, and then checked the ledger, and then checked the posted policy one last time, the way a child checks a front door lock before bed. She did not beam, she did not preen. She learned something and kept it. The supervisor invited signatures. He initialed my grid lines and the ledger. The two parishioners wrote their names as witnesses to a review conducted under policy. The maestro added his name with a small flourish shaped by years of writing cues on scores.
The attendant stamped the acknowledgment copy and handed it to me for my envelope. The security guard wrote his final line and closed his pocket log with a polite click, the sound of a lid settling where it belongs. Then came the recognition that belonged not to me, but to the procedure in front of everyone. The supervisor read a brief statement of completion. All entries 1 through 12 accounted for, including the delayed deposit now confirmed by bank acknowledgement, the donor's receipt verified and linked to the ledger line, the policy read and followed in public with witnesses present. He added the new training date to the bulletin board and stood aside so the laminated summary could be taped at eye level. The hall absorbed this without applause, which felt right. Justice in small rooms is best when it looks like routine restored. I placed the receipt and the acknowledgement slip back in the clear envelope, slid the maestro's letter behind them, and pressed the flap with my thumb to seal it. The envelope made the small squeak that cellophane makes when it moves from one humidity to another. I held it a second longer than I needed to, then tucked it under my arm where it had begun the night. The weight felt lighter only because it no longer had to argue its existence.
The parente stepped closer. The distance that had carried insult at the start softened into the compromise of a shared bench. Her hand lifted and then paused, and I offered mine, not as a stage, but as a bridge. The clasp was brief and dry and human. No spectacle rose from it. The choir took an inhaled breath for their final piece, the kind that fills a chest and, if you are not careful, fills your eyes. We did not change the world. We changed the way this table will treat a person on a wet October evening, and that is the size of world a body can hold without breaking it. The maestro returned to his room. The supervisor filed the binder with the stamp still damp. The volunteer taped the laminated policy so the corners lay flat. The attendant aligned the pens and clipped the stamp to the tray. The security guard nodded once to the air and once to me, logging nothing more because nothing more needed logging. I stepped back from the counter and let the hall widen to its usual shape. Ava took my sleeve, and we stood there for one breath longer than necessary, watching the light clear through the frosted pane of the office door. The hymn began again, not for us, but not without us, and I let it pass through as if the room itself were a chest exhaling. I felt the memory of my wife settle behind my sternum like a hand smoothing a wrinkle from a shirt. I walked toward the doorway with the envelope under my arm and the grid in my pocket, and I left behind a table that now knew how to count to 12 without forgetting the last number. Dignity is defended in small squares of ink and steady breath. Did this move you? Like, subscribe, and say in the comments how you'd handle it with your family. See you in the next chapter.